Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and this video is about Epicurus, letter to Menoeceus. So Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher, I guess the distinguishing point, two main points of this short essay. The first is that we shouldn't be afraid of death, because when you're dead, you're gone. There's no soul. And death is defined as the absence of sentience, of awareness. So what is there to fear? There's only the fear of when death is there, you won't be there anymore. So what you're really afraid of is the prospect of death in the future, but you'll never actually experience death, because death is the absence of life. So don't be afraid of death. And live a life that's as simple as possible, so that your desires are as simple as possible, and then you'll be happy. He defines happiness as absence of pain and fear. So if you can habituate yourself, therefore, he says in the middle of page 459, to habituate oneself, therefore, to simple and inexpensive diet supplies. All right, so the translation's a little mixed up, but to habituate oneself to a simple and inexpensive diet supplies all that is needed for health and enables a man to meet the necessary requirements of life without shrinking, and it places us in a better condition when we approach at intervals a costly fare and renders us fearless of fortune. So sober reasoning to help us realize that we should limit our desires to the ones that are most easily satisfied, will lead to a happy life. Happiness defined as the absence of pain. And then if we can get rid of the fear of forthcoming death, we'll live as in a godlike way, even though his understanding of the gods is a little ambiguous. He starts out on page 457 by saying after the first paragraph and a little into the next one, he says, first, believe that God is a living being, immortal and blessed, according to the notion of a God indicated by the common sense of mankind. And so believing, you shall not affirm of him anything that is foreign to his immortality or that is repugnant to his blessedness. So that just sounds like a regular believing God. But then he goes on to say, for there are gods, and the knowledge of them is manifest, but they are not such as the multitude believe, seeing that men do not steadfastly maintain the notions they form respecting them. All right, well, that just seemed to contradict what he said in the sentence before, because above he said, for believe that God is a living being, immortal and blessed, according to the notion of God indicated by the common sense of mankind. So believe what the common sense of mankind says, but then he says, don't believe about the gods what the multitude believe. If you do that, that is truly impious. And then he'll go on to say, for the utterances of the multitude about the gods are not true preconceptions, but false assumptions. Hence it is that the greatest evils happen to the wicked, and the greatest blessings happen to the good from the hands of the gods, seeing that they are always favorable to their own good qualities and take pleasure in men like themselves, but reject as alien whatever is not of their kind. So it seems like he believes in the gods, but not the stories of the gods that you'll find in normal religions. And it seems here he's saying that the gods favor those who are good and punish the wicked. But he'll go right on to the very next paragraph. He'll say, accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply the capacity for sensation, and death is the privation of all sentience. Therefore, a correct understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not by adding to life a limitless time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. All right, so he does not believe in a soul. So if there are gods and they punish the wicked, that punishment has to happen while they're alive. There's no punishment in the afterlife. So don't fear going to hell, he'll say, and don't get your hopes up about going to heaven, because when you're dead, you're gone. But at the very least, Epicurus is saying that realization will free you from the fear of dying, because he'll reason it out, and I've explained it before. when death comes, you won't be there anymore to suffer from it. So it's nothing. That's what it means. It's nothing to you. It's impossible to ever experience it because it is defined as the absence of experience itself. So let me go to these discussion questions, and then I'll fill in some of the details of Epicurus' philosophy. So on page 461, compare Epicurus' ideas to Aristotle's Nichomachaen ethics. What are some similarities and differences? Explain. So one similarity is that neither one talks about an afterlife, the soul living after the body dies, which is a departure of Aristotle from his teacher Plato, who definitely did say that there is an afterlife. They also say the highest goal is happiness, and that we should seek happiness through living a life guided by reason, a virtuous life guided by reason. We should habituate ourselves to a virtuous life. And I went over all the details of that when I went over the Aristotle reading, which was just before this Nichomachaen ethics. The Nichomachaen ethics is the reading just before the letters to Menoeceus. So I went over all the details of where Aristotle talks about living a virtuous life guided by reason, finding the mean between two extremes. So that's very similar to what Epicurus is saying. A big difference is Aristotle says the highest science is political science. Whatever the goal of the politicians is will be the goal of the human being in general, because the politicians decide which of the other sciences are even studied in the state and to what degree and who studies them. So it's the master science. And Aristotle is assuming that human life is engaged in a political arena, dealing with other people, whereas Epicurus implies that we should make our lives as simple and independent as possible. So if you could satisfy yourself with just drinking water and eating bread and just have the simplest diet that will keep you healthy, that would be the happiest life. Whereas for Aristotle, that would probably not be considered a mean. It would probably, between two extremes, he'd probably consider that closer to a vice, because the mean would be probably just regular citizenship, whereas the deficiency of that would be a recluse, and the excess of that would be, somebody who's always going to parties and too intent on community and not enough on taking care of their own business. I don't know exactly what mean and extremes Aristotle would call it, but at any rate, he defines the human as a political animal, and a happy life would be engaged with others, whereas Epicurus inclines towards withdrawing as much as possible from the world. He says on the bottom of page 458, we must also reflect that of desires some are natural, others are groundless, and that of the natural some are necessary as well as natural, and some natural only. So right there, he's asking you to categorize your desires. So what would be an example of a desire that's natural but not necessary? Well, for example, sex. It's a natural desire, but if you don't have sex, you won't die. You might feel like you're going to die, but if you don't drink water, you actually will die. If you don't breathe air, you will die. So the desire for those is natural and necessary. Other desires that you won't die from if you don't satisfy them are only natural, and some aren't even natural. So he'll go on to say, and of the necessary desires, some are necessary if we are to be happy, some if the body is to be rid of uneasiness, some if we are even to live. He who has a clear and certain understanding of these things will direct every preference and aversion towards securing health of body and tranquility of mind, seeing that this is the sum and end of a blessed life. For the end of all our actions is to be free from pain and fear, and when once we have attained all this, the tempest of the soul is laid. So, to be free from all pain and fear, that's how he defines happiness. He defines it in a negative way. It's not the positive attainment of anything, it's the absence of pain and fear. He'll then go on at the top of page 459. He says, wherefore we call pleasure the alpha and omega of a blessed life. Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and of every aversion, and to it we come back inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which to judge of every good thing. All right, so pleasure is the beginning and the end of a blessed life, but he defines pleasure as the absence of pain. And he'll go on to say that later on page 459 in the third full paragraph, about halfway down. He says, by pleasure we mean the absence of pain in the body and of troubles in the soul. It is not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and of revelry, not sexual lust, not the enjoyment of the fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table which produce a pleasant life. It is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs through which the greatest tumults take possession of the soul. Of all this, the beginning and the greatest good is wisdom. Therefore, wisdom is a more precious thing even than philosophy. From it spring all other virtues, for it teaches that we cannot live pleasantly without living wisely, honorably, and justly, nor live wisely, honorably, and justly without living pleasantly, for the virtues have grown into one with a pleasant life, and a pleasant life is inseparable from them. That's very similar to Aristotle. Aristotle repeats that basic idea throughout the Nichomachaen ethics. For example, on page 436, he says, at the very end of that whole middle paragraph is similar to what we just read from Epicurus, but if you skip to the bottom of the paragraph, he says, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. Right across the page, at the bottom of page 437, he says, with those who identify happiness with virtue or some one virtue, our account is in harmony, for to virtue belongs virtuous activity. Over on page 438, section 9, for this reason also the question is asked whether happiness is to be acquired by learning or by habituation or some other sort of training. So we know he'll go on to say that virtue is gained by habit, by habitually acting in a way that's in accordance with reason, which determines the mean between two extremes of action. That is how you develop the virtues, through habit. And that is what Epicurus says on page 459. In the middle of the page, he says, to habituate oneself, therefore, to simple and an inexpensive diet supplies all that is needful for health. So the idea is you have to habituate yourself to only trying to satisfy the desires that are easily satisfied and required for a healthy life. On page 442, Aristotle says, section 13, since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue. And he'll go on to say it's a state of character developed by habits. So I just gave a few examples comparing Epicurus to Aristotle. All right, the discussion question 2 on page 461. Which elements of Epicurus' advice to Menoeceus do you think are worth following? Why? Explain. So if that's one of the questions on the exam, then just choose one of the, or several of these points that he makes and explain why you find it to be wise and worth following. For example, if you don't believe in an afterlife, you might say, well, I think that's good advice. Why be afraid and worry at all about death since you'll never experience it? Or, you might think, oh, it makes good sense. If I can simplify my desires through habitually only satisfying the ones that are necessary, then I'll be happy. It's not that I should go out and work really hard in life to try to acquire all these great things and signs of success, because those only satisfy you if you've developed the desire for them. But if you work in the opposite direction and develop the habit of only desiring simple things, then you'll be just as happy and work a whole lot less. Maybe that's a good idea. Okay, so you get the idea on how to answer discussion question 2. So discussion question 3, explain Epicurus' position on death. We've been over that several times. Death is nothing to us because death is the absence of sentience. So when it comes, you are not there anymore. So why be afraid of it? I'll read one last sentence about that on page 458. About a quarter of the way down, he says, death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that, when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not. It is nothing then either to the living or to the dead, for with the living it is not, and the dead exist no longer. That will sum it up for Epicurus, but that sentence is very similar to the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna tells Arjuna that the wise lament on page 376, just about in the middle of the page. He says, learned men grieve not for the living nor the dead. Never did I not exist, nor you, nor these rulers of men, nor will any one of us ever hereafter cease to be. So he gives the exact same advice. Don't grieve for the living or the dead. Don't fear death, but for the opposite reason, because you can't die. The soul doesn't die. Okay, Epicurus says the exact opposite. And that's another interesting point, I think, to think about. The same exact advice on how to live from the exact opposite philosophical perspective. Krishna says, don't get carried away by sense desires, because you should try to escape the cycle of reincarnation, and your soul should try to reunite with God. Epicurus says the same thing. Don't let bodily desires carry you away, not because he's worried about the afterlife, but because he says you'll be miserable in this life. And that is an interesting point that I notice throughout this book. We've been doing a chronological analysis of the 4 fundamental questions. And then not only is it chronological, it alternates basically between theistic and atheistic perspectives. And so they are widely divergent when it comes to the first 3 fundamental questions. Who or what am I? What is real? What can I know? But when they get to the 4th fundamental question, what should I do? Who should I be? How should I live my life? Their advice starts to really converge and be very similar, whether they're atheists or theists. Epicurus, he says he believes in gods, but he doesn't believe in a soul. He doesn't, so maybe, I don't know how sincere his belief in God was, but at any rate, his advice about how to live a life is basically the same as Plato's is, although Plato does believe in an afterlife. So that's just an interesting point to see how they all say, well, control your bodily sense desires, don't let them get carried away, and don't fear death, and use a life guided by reason. That's whether they're atheists or theists, empiricists or rationalists, it's pretty much the same advice. Okay, the next reading is the Enchiridion by Epictetus, and we will come back to him.